Hello, my name is Annie Zhao, and this is Data Management 3, where we are grouping and summarizing data for visualization. In this first video, we will be focusing on two commands, one being group by, and two being summarize at, in order to better visualize data. Before we get into our script, I want to go over why these two commands are important to us. When we're visualizing data descriptively, we have thousands or sometimes even millions of data points. We need to summarize that information for an audience. We could make a picture for every single data point, but this can be really hard to understand. Sometimes we need to collapse that information down, and then we can make a nice plot of, for example, how this variable changes over time, or how the average of this variable compares across several different groups. But that often means condensing down to annual averages, or regional averages, or region year averages, etc., before we can make pictures that we want to look at. So this is really a training about collapsing that data down, which we will mostly do with two functions, as I mentioned earlier. Number one being group by, which tells us which groups we want to collapse down to, and number two being summarize at, which tells us which variables we want to summarize and how we want to do that. We introduced group by and summarize in our first data management module, but now we're covering them in a little bit more depth with a focus on setting ourselves up for data visualization. You will notice that we are now also focusing on summarize at, which is essentially a scoped version of the summarize command and allows us to summarize multiple variables at once. By using these commands, we can take the sum of a variable across whatever units we are grouping by, or we could take the average or the maximum value or the minimum value. We have several different options of how we want to summarize things, and we can even summarize multiple variables at once. Let's head into this R script. So we've got a standard header here in the beginning describing what the script is about and who wrote it. And we're also going to remove any junk in the environment before we get going on line 11. And we're setting our working directory to a folder that houses both our training data subfolder and our training output subfolder. My working directory is on line 14, but if you would like someone else to be able to run your code, they can set their own working directory as well, like on line 17. We're also loading in the packages that we're going to use today. And if you don't have these packages installed already, then you will have to install them using the install packages command. And we are working with our power sharing data again today. We like to use the data we create in the lab in our own training so that you can get familiar with it. Today, we're going to work with just 3 variables. The first one being subnational control of educational policy, which is sub-ed. Second one being subnational control of police or paramilitary forces, which is sub-police. And third one being the power of subnational governments to levy their own taxes, which is sub-tax. We will also keep our key identifier variables, which are number 1 being GWNO, and then a year, as well as the country name, because it's nice to be able to see what's really going on here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some tables with the values in the measures of subnational policy authority. These tables essentially show the frequency of each binary variable. So here we have these 3 binary variables, just zeros and ones. Now let's do this first collapse. What if we wanted to talk about the prevalence of these institutions over time? How common is it to decentralize authority? How has federalism changed over time in the world? Those are all really good questions to ask. If we want to see how the world as a whole has been changing over time, then we want to take all this country year data and turn it into just yearly averages or yearly sums. we're going to start with yearly sums of how many countries in the world have subnational control of educational policy in a year. How many countries in the world have subnational control of police or paramilitary forces in each year? We're going to collapse that down. We're still working with tidyverse here, and we're going to pipe stuff together, starting with our lovely IDC power sharing data. We are going to group by year, or in other words, we're going to collapse it down by year. We're going to use the summarize at function here on line 56, and we're going to tell R, the variables we want to work with, which are these three: subed, subpolice, and subtax. We are taking the sum of each variable, and the last thing we're going to do is we are going to tell R that NARM equals true. So when we're adding these all up, R doesn't know how to add NA as a number, so we will have to tell R how to handle these NA values. Here we're just telling R, just ignore all the NAs and add up all the zeros and ones that are there. So when we're taking a sum and ignoring the NAs, that is the equivalent of treating those NAs as if they're zeros, essentially, because they're not going to end up in that sum. Now, if you're really on point here, you might be worrying that this could make our figure a little bit misleading. If the number of missing values is changing over time, that could be misleading. So let's put a pin on that and we'll discuss it later. For now, let's just run this as a sum and then see what the resulting object is like. And this is going to be called yearly count 1. So I'm going to display that object. And, well, since we don't have country year data anymore, we just have year. And the totals for each of our three variables, it looks like subtax is increasing in frequency, as well as subpolice and subed, and increasing over time more or less. We have a little retrenchment here in the last year by just a little bit, but ultimately we can see that there is a changing prevalence of these institutions over time, and we should question whether or not sum is the way to actually do this. Maybe not. So in the next video, we will be looking at another way to see how federalism has changed over time in the world. Thank you for joining us in this video, and we will see you in our next Data Management 3 video, where we will be thinking about a different way to look at the same issue. Goodbye.